In medieval times, before the convenience of refrigerators or takeout, people had to get creative to keep food fresh. Kitchens were busy, smoky hubs filled with hanging meats, herbs, and an abundance of salt. They relied on preserving basics like dried vegetables, salted meats, and bread, as food needed to be stored for the harsh winter ahead. Without modern conveniences, they made do with ingenious, and sometimes bizarre, methods to keep their pantry stocked. It's hard to imagine explaining something like ketchup to a medieval cook, but they were masters of preserving what they had, knowing they couldn't just order a pizza when the cold set in. Salt was so valuable in ancient times that Roman soldiers were paid in it, giving rise to the word salary. In medieval Venice, traders built vast fortunes controlling the salt trade, essentially becoming the tech moguls of their day, but with salt instead of smartphones. The salting process involved rubbing meat or fish with an overwhelming amount of salt, sometimes up to 20% of the food's weight, causing it to shrink and dry out, much like beef jerky. One medieval recipe even called for salting meat until it looked like it was covered in snow, which sounds eerily like my own cooking disasters. They salted everything: fish packed in barrels, pork turned into ham or bacon, and even vegetables like cabbage, which became sauerkraut through fermentation. Surprisingly, medieval doctors believed salt was healthy, a far cry from our modern health guidelines. Salt was incredibly expensive in medieval times, with a pound sometimes costing a week's wages. In one famous story, a French village traded an entire flock of sheep just for enough salt to survive the winter. When salt was scarce, people turned their kitchens into smokehouses, filling the room with so much smoke that medieval cooks would probably feel right at home in a modern BBQ joint. Without exhaust fans, everyone likely smelled like smoked bacon all the time, but that wasn't a bad thing. The smoking process itself was brilliant. Meat and fish hung in chimneys or rafters, where the smoke from the fire worked its magic. Different woods, like oak for beef and apple for pork, added distinct flavors. A 1375 smokehouse found in London still smelled like smoke after 600 years, showing how effective the technique was. The smoke not only added flavor, but also created a protective layer that kept bacteria and bugs away, like an early food force field. They even smoked cheese and grains to preserve them, with some modern cheeses like smoked Gouda, tracing their roots back to these medieval methods. They even smoked eggs. Imagine explaining that to your chickens. Wealthier homes had separate smokehouses with different levels for different foods, like a medieval multi-level parking garage, but with hanging meats instead of cars. So, what do you do when smoking isn't cutting it anymore? Medieval folks turned to nature's cold storage. No, really. They got pretty inventive with snow and ice. Think underground cellars that acted like the medieval version of refrigerators. But instead of an ice maker, you had servants running around collecting snow and ice in the winter, like they were gathering some frozen treasure. The wealthier nobles took it to the next level with ice houses. These weren't your average backyard sheds. Think underground ice bunkers. The largest one ever found was at Hampton Court Palace, and it could hold 75 tons of ice. That's enough to keep a whole medieval army stocked up with slushies. The ice houses were built like upside-down ice cream cones, dug deep into the earth with thick, sturdy walls. Some aristocrats even hired ice masters, whose job was to keep the ice from melting. Now that's a cool job title. And get this. Some ice houses kept ice frozen for up to 2 years. The trick? They packed sawdust between layers of ice to create a medieval version of insulation. Move over, modern coolers. But what if you weren't rich enough for an ice bunker? Well, caves and stone cellars were your next best bet. Natural caves kept a pretty consistent temperature of 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Perfect for storing food. People used these cool spaces to keep cheese, eggs, and veggies fresh. Some monasteries even built artificial caves just to store wine and beer. Those monks knew how to prioritize. One hilarious fact: medieval folks used to store perishable food in snow during winter parties. Imagine being the medieval event planner. Okay, we need 3 barrels of wine, 2 roasted pigs, and enough snow to keep the fish from spoiling. Maybe grab some extra for a snowball fight. They even served frozen desserts at fancy feasts, basically medieval snow cones flavored with honey or fruit juice. And yes, they'd sometimes write cheeky warnings like, "Don't eat the yellow snow." Some things never change. That ice melted away. It was time to get serious about drying food. And by serious, I mean everything. Medieval people turned drying into an art. Meat became jerky. Grapes became raisins. Plums turned into prunes. Fruits and veggies were strung up on ropes, hanging from rafters like weird, never-ending food decorations. Some folks even built special drying towers. These tall buildings had slatted sides to let air flow through while keeping birds out. One famous tower in France could dry over 2,000 pounds of fruit at once, more fruit than you'd see in a modern grocery store. Locals called them fruit castles, which is honestly way cooler than calling them food dehydrators. Some of these towers still exist, and archaeologists have found dried fruit bits stuck in corners that are over 500 years old. Talk about ancient snacks. The best part? They figured out that different foods needed different drying techniques. Herbs got bundled up and hung upside down, making kitchens look like botanical gardens. Meat? Cut it into super thin strips, because the thinner, the better. A whole cookbook was dedicated to drying instructions. One recipe warned, if your dried beef bounces when dropped, you've done it right. If it shatters, you've made a weapon. They even dried fish, beating it flat until it was practically paper thin. These dried fish were so hard, they could probably double as roof tiles in an emergency. There's even a story about Norwegian sailors using dried fish as plates. Talk about multi-purpose. Dried food was lightweight and perfect for armies, who could carry weeks' worth of provisions without needing a wagon. They even had a keeper of the dry stores, a medieval job title that sounds a bit underwhelming at parties. But imagine the excitement. What's for dinner tonight, Captain? Dried beef. Tomorrow? Still dried beef. Next week? Take a wild guess. But sometimes drying just wasn't enough, especially in places with too much humidity. That's when the medieval secret weapon came into play: vinegar. The medieval world was obsessed with fermentation. They pickled everything. Cabbage turned into sauerkraut, cucumbers became pickles, and fish got fermented too. One medieval German cookbook even says, put it in vinegar until it stops smelling like fish and starts smelling like regret. Some historians think medieval Europeans pickled more food per person than any other civilization. The science of fermentation? Pretty wild. They intentionally let food go bad, just in the right way. Certain bacteria would fight off the bad ones, keeping food preserved and fighting diseases like scurvy. One barrel of sauerkraut could feed a family through winter and give them enough vitamin C to avoid scurvy. Medieval folks were battling pirate diseases before pirates even got cool. Some monasteries had entire rooms dedicated to fermentation. One French monastery pickled over 15,000 eggs in a year. Can you imagine the monk who had that job? Oh, you're in charge of the library. Well, I'm just over here pickling thousands of eggs and smelling like vinegar 24/7. The monks even wrote poems about pickling, including one with 50 verses about how to ferment turnips. But the real fermentation champions were the Vikings. They turned fish into lutefisk, a jelly-like fermented fish soaked in lye. They considered it a delicacy. One Old Norse saying translates to, "A brave man fears many things, but only a fool fears not the lutefisk." Archaeological digs found Viking fermentation barrels with traces of fish that are over 1,000 years old. Thankfully, nobody's tried tasting them. And get this, fermented foods actually got better with age. Some noble families had barrels of pickled vegetables passed down like heirlooms. One barrel of pickled cabbage found in a castle had been maintained for over 40 years. They also used fermentation in medicine, fermented cabbage juice for headaches, pickled radishes for upset stomachs. One hospital went through 50 gallons of fermented vegetable juice every month. Whether it helped the patients or just gave them more to complain about, we'll never know. If you wanted food to last for years, though, you turned to honey. It never goes bad. Scientists once found 3,000-year-old honey in Egyptian tombs that was still good. Medieval people knew about honey's superpowers and used it to preserve everything from fruits to birds. One recipe even suggested preserving a whole peacock in honey, because regular chicken just wasn't fancy enough. Beekeepers were rock stars in medieval times, often paid more than cooks. A skilled beekeeper could manage up to 100 hives, producing enough honey to preserve food for an entire village. They even believed that honey from bees that had visited holy sites was better. If you wanted pure honey, you'd drop a chicken feather in it. If the feather sank too fast, it wasn't pure enough. If your honey can't hold a feather, it can't hold your dinner. And speaking of preservation, alcohol was another game changer. Medieval folks realized that alcohol wasn't just for toasts, it was a great way to preserve fruits, veggies, and even eggs. One French castle used over 100,000 liters of wine a year. Half of it was for preserving food. Wine killed bacteria and kept everything fresh. Monasteries even dedicated entire cellars to preserving food and alcohol. They'd soak plums, cherries, peaches, and even meat in wine. Imagine drunken fruit cocktail garnishes at a medieval feast. Nothing says classy like boozy fruit. The truly fancy nobles took it up a notch, layering fruits with different wines to create beautiful patterns in jars. One family preserved fruit in red and white wine, creating a striped medieval flag effect. And get this, stronger alcohol worked better for preserving food, which led to some enthusiastic experimentation in distillation. No, my lord, I'm not making stronger wine for fun. It's for preserving the royal pears. Trust me. And that, my friends, is how medieval folks figured out how to preserve food in 7 totally unique ways, from salt to honey to booze. They found a way to keep food fresh through all kinds of challenges. So the next time you open your fridge, thank your medieval ancestors, and maybe skip the wine-soaked eggs.